an assistant professor in the computer science department at the University of Maryland, College Park, which is sort of near Washington, D.C. in the U.S. And I'll speak to you about some recent research my group has been doing looking at empirical studies of best practices. So I'm sure everybody here sort of already knows, right, what you do in security operations. People are monitoring their organization's security posture, managing infrastructure, and doing things like incident response, right? On the software development side, we have lots of secure development practices, which sometimes include dedicated security teams, a lot of time spent on code review and patching and mitigation and all these things. And, altogether, this adds up to lots and lots of employees who have something related to security in their mission, lots of equipment, lots of training, lots of compliance standards, just lots and lots of things, lots of dollars, right, that are spent on all of these kinds of security goals, and lots of best practices about how organizations should be trying to handle their security stuff correctly. But it turns out that there's actually not a lot of empirical evaluation for a lot of these best practices. So these are kind of just understood as sort of the common wisdom of the best things to do, but not a lot of measurement about which ones actually help and how much they actually help, and what really works and what we're only sort of doing just because we've kind of always done it and keep doing it. And so my group has been trying to change that a bit along with some other great researchers by trying to bring some empiricism to some of these questions. So in particular today I'll talk about two studies that Sonia kind of mentioned. One about the impact of threat modeling at the enterprise level, and one about the use of capture the flag contests as secure development tools for training software developers to be better at secure development. So this first study that I'll talk about, which was joint work with a bunch of my students and also some collaborators from a couple different places, is about threat modeling in the New York City government. So threat modeling obviously has been around for a really long time. There are a whole lot of different frameworks for doing threat modeling. You can do threat modeling sort of at the time when you are trying to develop software. You can also do threat modeling in terms of security operations in an organization to try to understand what you're supposed to be defending against. But somewhat surprisingly, there's not been a whole lot of evaluation of these different threat modeling frameworks. So there's been a little bit of work where sort of you teach some students in a security class and you kind of have them try threat modeling with a couple of different frameworks and compare their answers, but there hasn't been a lot of sort of more large-scale or not involving students kind of work. And so we were lucky enough to be able to do some evaluation of threat modeling approaches at an enterprise scale by cooperating with the New York City Cyber Command, which is the city government agency in charge of protecting all of the computers and digital equipment for the city of New York. And we were lucky enough to be able to work with them on a 120-day longitudinal study where we sort of trained them to do some threat modeling, and then they attempted to use it, and we were able to observe sort of what happened as a result of them trying to use the threat modeling. So the study worked kind of like this. We took a baseline survey to try to understand their existing processes and sort of their existing security posture. We provided them with an hour of group training in something called the Center of Gravity framework. So this is one particular threat modeling framework. It's based on a military theory developed in the late 1800s by a guy named Karl von Clausewitz. That's Karl. And it's been adapted to sort of a cybersecurity context. We picked this one not because it's the best one or particularly special, but it is the one that my graduate student who was heading up this project was the most familiar with, and it's sort of, in some ways, it's kind of a middle one. It partakes in some of the elements of many of the other kinds of common threat modeling frameworks. So we chose to use it here. After the group training, all the people who participated in sort of a 1-hour individual session, and the goal of the session is to use this center of gravity framework to produce what's called an actionable defense plan, which is just basically a list of new mitigation. What is the center of gravity is sort of the most important thing that your organization is trying to protect, and then the actionable defense plan is sort of concrete ideas of what you're going to do to try to protect it. And after they completed this individual session, we had them complete an exit survey, which had some questions about whether or not they had understood the framework and been able to apply it, and some questions about sentiment. So did they feel the framework was useful? Did they feel it was easy or hard to use? We also had a couple of high-ranking people from the NYC3 agency do sort of expert validation of these actionable defense plans. And the goal here was to try to understand, did these plans seem appropriate, and did they seem sufficiently concrete that they could actually be put into action, right? So if the plan just said sort of, as a straw man, if the plan said, make security better, then we would probably not grade that one as actionable, right? So and ideally, it would be nice to have sort of an independent third-party review these, but due to the specifics of how sensitive some of the data was, we asked some senior people from the organization to take a look at it. About 30 days later, we came back and repeated the exit survey to ask the people who had participated in the training whether they were, to see what they remembered about the training and to see whether they were using any of it in their daily work 30 days later. And then 120 days later, we received access to some logs from the organization to be able to look through and see what had actually happened. We also had some discussions with people at the organization to understand what had changed or not changed, and to try to measure what had happened in the 4 months since the training had happened. And throughout this process, we were trying to collect some metrics to try to understand how well it was working. And in particular, we borrowed from some existing work in software engineering and technology acceptance when we were thinking about these metrics. So we were thinking about things like perceived efficacy. So this is, do the people using the tool think that it's useful or effective? We used a metric of accuracy, which was sort of were the plans that these people came up with on target and actionable. A metric of actual adoption, so were people actually using the framework in their daily life? And then actual efficacy. So maybe you think it's useful and maybe you're using it, but can we measure whether it's actually useful in practice? So at the time of the baseline, we were able to recruit 25 participants, which was 37% of the entire NYC3 workforce, to participate in our study. And we found that the NYC3 operations were primarily sort of reactive. They were organized around commercial services, so buying network monitoring boxes off the shelf and placing them around the network, and organized around compliance standards. So, lists of rules that you have to have in order to work with credit card data or with taxpayer data in the US and things like this. And these get audited like once a year, and they organize their security strategy around getting ready for these audits. But it was very sort of reactive, right? Or they found some evidence of an intrusion and they responded to it, but it was not a lot of proactive planning. So in terms of perceived efficacy, after participating in the training, 12 of the 25 participants identified new concerns or issues that they had not previously thought about. And the thing that we found perhaps most interesting was that the participants reported being significantly more confident in their ability both to think critically about what they needed to do in their jobs to proactively secure their organization, and also to communicate. In particular, they felt like working with the framework gave them some confidence in their ability to communicate with their bosses and with higher level people in the organization what was important and what the risks were and why they might need to do something differently or have more resources for what they were working on. And one participant said that the framework helped them to plan effectively, document, track, monitor progress, and essentially understand our security posture more than it was previously. In terms of the actionable defense plans that were produced, so our senior experts labeled them as 96% accurate relative to the people's job role who participated in the study. They contain 94 new mitigation strategies that the organization was not already conducting, and 16 of the 25 were graded as ready for immediate implementation within the organization. And ideas from these actionable defense plans actually did start to be put into practice. In particular, one of the ideas that came out of the defense plan was the need for a bug bounty program for government websites and services. And they actually did put together sort of a trial short-term bug bounty program to test that out. They also identified some places in their network that were just missing sensor coverage. So they were basically able to rearrange some of the commercial network monitoring boxes that they had to cover blind spots that they had not realized that they had in their network. They added some redundancy steps in some of their configuration processes and in some of their processes for turning things on and off to ensure that configuration errors couldn't cause additional problems for them. And they added two-factor authentication for some of their more important accounts. And the picture actually here is some of the participants were so excited after participating in the training that they actually went into their break room and started creating a Scrum board to write down some of the plans that they wanted to implement and to make plans for sort of short, medium, and long-term actions that they wanted to take. And you may be looking at these and saying, you know, these seem kind of like obvious things to do, right? Like a bug bounty program and turning on two-factor authentication. And you're not wrong about that, and we'll sort of come back to that. We'll come back to that in a minute. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about some of the results. So the bug bounty program was active for about 48 hours. And in that time, they received information about and were later able to remediate 3 public-facing vulnerabilities that were identified via this bug bounty program. And they then started the process of sort of making this program permanent and official. And it's sort of there's a lot of bureaucracy involved in doing that, so it's taking a little while to come online, but they still have the goal of trying to make this process permanent. In terms of the improved sensor coverage, by moving these boxes around, they were able to block 541 intrusion attempts that were all in areas that were just previously completely not covered by these sensors. And one might ask the question, like, if there were these many attempts in 3 months after they moved the sensors around, what was happening in that part of the network before they moved the sensors around? Which is a really interesting question that my NDAs do not allow me to answer. And then finally, I told you that they turned on two-factor authentication. And in fact, looking through the logs, they found 5 instances where one of their privileged accounts appeared to be logged into from somewhere overseas, so somewhere not in the US, where the person had the correct password, but was stopped by the use of the two-factor authentication. So that's 5 privileged accounts that potentially could have been hijacked without the two-factor authentication being in place. So this is all pretty interesting, but it's sort of a case study in one organization. I think it's worth talking about that a little bit, right? So in particular, what we didn't do here was try to compare different kinds of threat modeling frameworks, right? I'm not here to tell you center of gravity is like the one correct threat modeling framework that everybody should use. This is just the one that we tried. And it worked really well in this case, but it's also the case that this is an organization that, as I mentioned, was sort of not already doing this kind of proactive planning. And what we did here was really give people a permission structure to think about this stuff more proactively, and the ability to sort of go and communicate with each other and with their bosses about how to think through these problems ahead of time and sort of proactively work on these kinds of ideas. It is, of course, the case when you sort of train people and then give them a survey about it that they're a little bit inclined to say, oh, yes, great job, we loved it, thank you very much. So we do sort of try to take those results with a little bit of salt in terms of, when they told us that they appreciated the training and that they thought that it was useful. We tried to mitigate that a bit by coming back 30 days later and by having them fill out all of these surveys sort of anonymously in a computer form rather than trying to, tell it to our faces or anything like that. And of course, it's hard to know how well this would generalize from our one case study organization to other organizations. Are there other sort of large organizations that organize their security kind of reactively and around compliance standards, and where there's maybe not enough communication about these kinds of security issues going on? I suspect there probably are some, and that this might generalize to other places like that. But of course, without trying, it's hard to entirely know. So taking away from this study, this was sort of less than 2 hours of training with a pretty immediate impact, including sort of 94 new mitigation strategies and measurable security improvements. And on some level, none of these security improvements are stunning, right? None of these are things that are sort of unexpected, right? Some of these are best practices, like using two-factor authentication and employing bug bounty programs. But it turned out that giving people a chance to break out of sort of their day-to-day routines and their focus on auditing and compliance allowed them the space to adopt these new practices that actually did make an important difference for them and think proactively and communicate. And then the second study that I'm going to talk about has to do with capture the flag competitions. So as most of you probably know, capture the flag competitions are sort of attack-oriented competitions where teams can compete to exploit something, to capture information, and then get points for correctly exploiting the vulnerabilities. And they provide nice exposure to sort of different kinds of vulnerabilities and practice in recognizing them and exploiting them. So CTFs are lots of fun. Lots of people who participate in them will tell you that they have a great time. But they're one of the goals in many cases for these CTFs is not just to have fun, but also to behave in particular as security training for people. And in particular, we worked with a company called Dropbox, which runs an annual CTF competition for their software developers. With the goal, it's run by their security team, of helping their software developers get better at recognizing possible security vulnerabilities and avoiding introducing vulnerabilities into their code. And we spoke to these people on the Dropbox security team, and they said, everybody enjoys this CTF, we have lots of fun, but is it really working in terms of helping people learn about security? And so we put together a field study to try and find out. So the Dropbox Capture the Flag study takes place over the course of about a month, and we designed a study around it where that included a diary study, which we would interview people on, or sort of send them a weekly survey about what they were working on, and I'll show more details about this in a minute. We also gave participants in the Capture the Flag study a pre- and post-knowledge assessment to measure what they had learned during the course of the Capture the Flag contest. And then we were also able to collect some metrics from the Dropbox system about things like how often people had communicated with the security team, how often any of their commits were flagged by any of the automated systems for potential security issues, other issues like this. So in the diary study, we would send people a survey regarding a recent commit that they had made to the Dropbox codebase. And we asked them questions about sort of what they were trying to do in that commit. So were they trying to improve performance, fix a bug, worry about security, and what they had done to try to resolve that problem. It's important to note that these were not security specific. And this questionnaire was actually open to people who both did and did not participate in the CTF. And we explicitly did not tell them that it was connected to the CTF, and so that was just to get some hope that they would mention security only if they were actually thinking about it, and not because we had sort of told them we were looking for security-relevant ideas. So we wanted to try to understand here whether there was any change in thinking about security on a day-to-day basis. The knowledge assessment required people to find and fix a vulnerability in a code snippet. These were drawn from real issues that Dropbox had experienced in their code base in the past, and these were limited only to the CTF participants to try and measure how much their knowledge did or did not increase by participating in the CTF. So far, we conducted a pilot version of this with a small number of participants. We also conducted a bigger version, but the data analysis for that one is very close to, but not entirely finished, so I'll sort of share with you the results from the pilot, and you can take them sort of as preliminary results that we hopefully will be able to confirm with the bigger study soon. So in the pilot, we had 28 diary participants, of which 12 were also participants in the CTF, and they completed a total of 169 of these surveys about particular commits they had worked on, and 7 of the people also participated in the knowledge assessment. So we found that only 17 of the 124 code commits that we asked people about did they mention anything related to security, so it was a very small portion of what they were actually working on. These were slightly more likely to happen for the CTF people than the non-CTF people, but it was so slight that it's hard to know, especially with a small sample size, whether that's a real finding or just a coincidence. And digging deeper, we sort of look at the kinds of problems that they did have. So when they said that they were considering security, what were they thinking about? And we can see that the non-CTF participants and the CTF participants were all kind of thinking about things like logic bugs, but the CTF people were more likely to be thinking about things like web security bugs, cross-site scripting, or CSRF than the people who did not participate in the CTF. So they were thinking about different kinds of security issues. We did also ask them, when they were considering security in these commits, why they were thinking about security. And we found that sort of everybody said, oh, this is because it's a standard practice and it's important to think about security. But the CTF participants were more likely to be thinking about security because of, they said they were dealing with sensitive data, or because they were worried about hackers. So thinking more of sort of an adversarial mindset about what could go wrong. And then we also asked our CTF participants sort of where they went for help, if they needed help with something related to security. And we found that the people who didn't participate in the CTF mostly stuck sort of with their team or with their previous experience, whereas the CTF participants who are orange here were more likely to go outside their team to external documentation and to consult with security experts. So these results are preliminary, but they're giving us a little bit of hope that participating in the CTF is causing people to think a little bit about different classes of vulnerabilities than they previously were, and to be a little more willing to go outside their team and look for extra help. And talking to the Dropbox security team, having developers who are more aware of when they need to ask for help, even if they don't know the solution to all of their security problems, is still sort of a pretty big win from their perspective. In terms of the knowledge assessment, so what I'm showing here is the change in their knowledge assessment score from before they participated in the CTF to after against their CTF score. So sort of, does how well they did in the CTF affect kind of how much they learned? And this orange bar is sort of the average CTF score, and then the red bar is kind of the average change in their knowledge assessment score. And what we can see is that sort of a lot of our participants, again, this is a small number because it's just a pilot, but they're in sort of either the top right or the bottom left. So people who did poorly in the CTF, their knowledge score assessment score didn't improve. People who did well in the CTF, their knowledge assessment score did improve. We do have sort of one outlier for this, which is someone who got everything right both before and after participating in the CTF, and also scored very highly in the CTF. So that's someone who sort of came in with a lot of expertise. But otherwise, we see that people who did well, which may map to sort of spending more time on it or learning more things from it, did better in the knowledge assessment afterwards. So our takeaways from the pilot here are that we hope, anyway, in this preliminary data, that it did improve our participants' knowledge of the kinds of vulnerabilities that were out there and gave them exposure to new classes of vulnerabilities. It increased their sort of overall consideration of security and improved their engagement with the security team. And we have some larger scale results coming soon, which hopefully we'll be able to confirm these findings and look at things in a little bit more depth. This is also the part where I insert the plug, where we are always looking for new research partners for these kinds of studies. So obviously this kind of empirical work works best when we can partner with people who are doing security things in the real world and want to understand how well they work or how well they don't work. In particular, we have a study going on currently where we're looking at incident response and playbooks. So for those who aren't familiar, a playbook is sort of a predefined, written down plan for what you're going to do in the event of some kind of security incident. It turns out there's a lot of best practices or guidelines out there for what you should put in your playbook, but surprise, surprise, none of those have been evaluated either. So we're currently looking into, in the midst of a study, evaluating some of those guidelines. We're always interested in measuring different kinds of security training and tools to see how well they work, interviews with security decision makers. We do have one interesting project where we're sending some students as sort of ethnographic interns to organizations to sort of embed in the organization and understand what their security practices sort of look like on the ground, and lots of other things. You know, if you're doing something security related and you're curious about evaluating it empirically, we're probably interested in helping. And if that applies to you, please feel free to send me an email. That's my email address, or this is a website where we, another thing that we're doing is we recruit people who work in security as software developers in security operations to participate in our panel. And what that means is that we may email you once in a while and invite you to participate in a study. I promise we will not email you too frequently, like only maybe once a month at most, and usually less than that. There's, of course, no obligation, but we may just say, oh, we're doing this interview study for people who have worked on this kind of tool before. Does that apply to you? Are you interested? So if you're interested, we could certainly have you sign up there. So just in terms of wrapping up, what we're finding as we do this work is that a lot of these security recommendations and best practices have not yet been sort of thoroughly empirically evaluated, and that measuring them really helps. And we're finding that, in many cases, a lot of these sort of best practices and conventional wisdom really do work, but not all of them do. And the more information we have about this, the more selective we can be about choosing to spend our time and resources on the right kinds of practices. We found that threat modeling can really empower people to plan ahead proactively and to communicate about what they need to do for security, and that at least in our preliminary data, participating in CTFs can improve developers' awareness a bit and hopefully their willingness to seek help.